Welcome to this OceanICU webinar on fish fisheries and ocean carbon. And we are delighted to have you here and thank you for taking the interest. Today, I'll be your host. I'm Debbie Podreski, based at the Marine Institute here in Ireland. And our speakers will be Professor Andre Visser, Dr. Jacob Bentley, and Professor David Reed. And you can read a little bit more about them here. Professor Andre Visser is the Professor of Physical Oceanography at the Technical University of Denmark. Dr. Jacob Bentley is the Principal Specialist in Marine Ecosystem Modelling in Natural England. And Professor Dave Reed is the Principal Investigator for the Ecosystem-Based Fisheries Management Team here at Marine Institute. There we go. So today I'll be giving you a brief introduction into OceanICU, the project, and then we'll move straight into the panelist presentations in this order you can see here. I'll give a quick intro to how we are working in OceanICU to connect to wider society, and then we'll have an open question and answer session. So you should see on your screens a Q&A button. So if you have questions throughout the talks, you can feel free to put them in there as we're going along, and we will come to them at the end. Just to note that this webinar is being recorded, so your cameras and your microphones have been disabled. So you will not be recorded yourselves, just yourselves with their lovely blue backgrounds. And the chat has been disabled, so you don't need to worry about any comments being shared with the recording. As I mentioned, the Q&A function is there, so please use that. And I will do my best to direct those questions to the appropriate panelist as we move along. Anything that we do not manage to get to today, we will work to answer and share with you with the little gift pack or swag bag that will be sent to your inboxes after the session. So I think it'll be early next week. If you have any problems or issues during this or any additional comments that you'd like to make, please feel free to contact us at hello@ocean-icu.eu. So kicking off a little bit about OceanICU. So this is the project that is bringing us all together. It's a pan-European project that's funded by Horizon Europe and the UK Research Institute. We have 31 partners spread across 15 different nations. It's taking place over 5 years. We've got 13.1 million euros in funding. And as you can see, the geographic spread of our group there. And not just geographic spread, but we also have a wide disciplinary spread across the group. The challenge that we are working towards is around how do we operate in a more carbon neutral way, and how do we account for the interactions that are going on out there? How does ocean carbon affect ocean users? And how do we understand and better account for both the direct effects, for instance, the emissions coming from things like shipping and fishing activity, and the indirect effects that may disturb the carbon sequestered in the seabed, for instance, or disturbances through food web interactions and so on. We're trying to understand better how large these effects are and how they operate, how we can reduce and minimize them, and how they affect or interact with our societies and our management. And with that, I am not going to say any more. I'm going to let our speakers enlighten us as to how we are tackling these issues. So I will hand straight over to Andre, please. Please go ahead.
Unmute. Thanks, Debbie. Thanks for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. Basically, I would like to talk to you a little bit today about how metazoans, fish in particular, how their vertical migrations impact the sequestration of carbon in the deep ocean. If I take the next slide, please. To put this into a little bit of context, I thought we'd start out with this diagram. It also will help frame the discussions this afternoon. Essentially, when we're talking about any sort of carbon sequestration in the ocean, basically what we're talking about are these reservoirs, these bubbles or these balloons, if you will, that you can conceive as being filled with carbon stored in some way in the Earth system. And I've represented them here in sort of terms of their size. So up in the top there, the red box, red circle, that's the atmospheric carbon. That's where the problem lies. There's 870 gigatons of carbon sitting up there. But in the oceans, there's actually really quite large reservoirs as well. The biggest being the dissolved inorganic carbon pool. There's 38,000 gigatons there. That bubble is so big it doesn't even fit on the page. And then there's other compartments that we can actually also talk about, like dissolved organic carbon. There's 700 gigatons there. There's marine sediments. And then if we want to put a little, put this into another perspective, the living biomass in the ocean, that's that little dot, that's only 5 gigatons there. So this sort of gives us a little bit of an indication about where carbon is sitting. It's not to say that the biomass of the living biomass is insignificant. It is actually responsible for everything within that stippled red line, which is the biological carbon pump, which includes the dissolved organic carbon pool, some biogenic carbonate from mineral carbons, plus all the respired dissolved inorganic carbon that you find in the ocean. And that's actually quite a lot. And if we take the next slide, because you might be interested in just to make sure I've covered everything. Oh, no, if we go back one more, sort of, So up there, essentially, when we're talking about fish carbon, what we need to understand is what role the fish play in maintaining all of these reservoirs. But perhaps equally important, are we doing things in terms of fisheries, which is reducing the capacity of any of these reservoirs to hold carbon? Are we squeezing them in some sense? So that's really that's really what we need to kind of address in this afternoon's talks. So if we take the next slide, please. I know you'll be, you probably heard a lot about various aspects of this already. The issue of blue carbon keeps on coming up time and again. But basically, in some sense, we can start thinking about blue carbon as being all the carbon that's in some sort of ocean reservoir, whether it's in the coastal region or whether it's in living biomass or in marine sediments or stored as dissolved in organic carbon in the ocean. That's probably a much more workable definition of blue carbon. So within that whole context, fish carbon is blue carbon. And by sequestration, essentially, we need to make that a little bit more concrete as well. So essentially, sequestration is any carbon in the Earth system that is not in contact with the atmosphere, and it's actually defined by two numbers: the flux of carbon going into that reservoir and the residence time of that material of that carbon within the reservoir. This is a very simple mass balance kind of definition of what we mean by a sequestered pool. At steady state, of course, you can write the size of the reservoir in terms of flux and residence time. And really what we're interested in are there any changes in that size of that reservoir, that B that I've written there, in terms of either expanding the size of those reservoirs, squeezing them, changing the flux in, or the residence time in those reservoirs. And that's really a fairly rigorous way of trying to think about these issues of carbon sequestration in the ocean. So we take the next slide. So what we're really talking about is the biological pump, which I'm sure everybody has heard something about. And I just want to put this slide up to remind you that there are actually two legs to the biological pump. There's the classical one that people think about quite often, or mostly, which is the particle flux, basically the sinking out of detrital material in terms of particular organic matter. But there is another leg, which is the migrant pump, which is sort of all these organisms from zooplankton to fish to squid, which are dancing up and down vertically, carrying part of that production from the surface ocean down into the deep ocean where it's sequestered for a longer time. So that's really just to give you a bit of an idea about where fish lie. If I take the next slide, please. This number that I've stated before, 1,300 gigatons. How do we actually come about that number? It's actually really quite surprising that it's only recently that people have actually thought about how much carbon is sequestered in the ocean by the biological pump. It's a concept that's been around for a long time, for 20, 25 years at least. But it's only recently that people have actually thought about how to quantify the sequestration of carbon in the ocean due to that. And this is perhaps the most up-to-date version. It's from Carter in 2000, from a couple of years ago. And essentially, it's a huge analysis of biogeochemistry in the ocean, where essentially it's a big inverse model where the products of respiration are looked at, either in terms of the material that is ejected, like the nutrients and the carbon dioxide, the silicate and the alkalinity, and or the carbon dioxide that's drawn in. And by doing a huge mass balance on the world's oceans, you get these numbers of about 1,300 gigatons being sequestered in the ocean through the respiration of organic material, and about 540 gigatons by the dissolution of mineral carbonates. That's just to give you those numbers, and we'll use those numbers in a minute to make some comparisons. So if we take the next slide, please. So balanced against all of that, we have this this leg of the biological pump, which has got to do with vertical migrants, and oftentimes this is referred to as Vinogradov's ladder. It's essentially a huge game that's played between organisms in the ocean, where they try to achieve the best possible arrangement of their vertical migrations in terms of feeding opportunity versus predation risk. And it does result in this big staggered relay of trophic interactions, which transports carbon all the way, organic carbon all the way from the surface ocean right through the center of the interior of the ocean, all the way down to the seabed. And we can sort of see evidence of this vertical migration in, for instance, these the depths of the deep scattering layer, where this big dance is going on a daily cycle. I put some ratios up there, the 13 to 1300, that's gigatons. So that's really the living biomass in the ocean versus the total amount that's sequestered by the respiration of organic matter. And the other one is also well worth noting, and that sort of like sets the scene, is that 50 petagrams, or 50 gigatons per year, that's around about the total productivity of the oceans, of which 20% enters the interior of the ocean, falls out of the surface and goes into the interior. And basically, I think it's a little bit of a, how would you say, an overreach to suggest that 20% of the total primary production in the world's oceans enters the interior of the deep oceans only to feed bacteria. I think there's a much more vibrant and rich community of consumers in the deep ocean that convert that into sequestered carbon. So if we take the next slide, please. Having said that, we've gone through some fairly large models to try to figure out exactly how this works. So going through again that whole staggered relay, understanding the vertical migration and the games that are played out. We've run through several models to estimate the total biomass of various taxa in the ocean. Used that to drive a game theoretic model to figure out their vertical migration, and utilizing that have used that to drive the injection rates of carbon dioxide, either in terms of respired carbon, fecal pellet material, or deadfall of all these different taxa within the world's ocean. And you can read a lot more about it in a paper. I won't go into details here, but if we take the next slide, you can see the results of that. These are basically the results. So this is an ensemble of many thousands of runs of this model, trying to capture the sensitivity of it, but fairly consistently it comes up with something of the order of 800 gigatons of carbon respired in the deep ocean has passed through a metazoan of one form or another. So that includes large fish all the way down to forage fish and to crustaceans. That's compared to this 1300, which is the total. So it's about 60%. And we classify exactly what the major drivers are of that. It turns out the mesopelagic fish, partly because of their abundance, but also because they migrate vertically a lot. They are the major contributors to that sequestration of carbon in the deep ocean. And we can go through and actually close the budget in various other ways. But if we take the next slide, please. That brings me to sort of a little bit of a summing up. Essentially, what this research indicates is that metazoans and fish and crustaceans in particular play an outsized role in global carbon sequestration. I mean, I said 60% has passed through some form of metazoan before it is sequestered in the deep ocean, and that is done with a biomass of less than 1 gigaton of living biomass. Having said that, it also means that fishing out metazoan biomass can have a much greater impact on global carbon budgets than the loss of biomass alone. There is an upscaling factor. For instance, there's a 500 to 1 upscale factor between living biomass of mesopelagics versus the carbon that they sequester. And this is something we can actually use to rank different taxa, different types of fish in terms of their carbon sequestration potential. And finally, I'd like to stress also that fisheries management is not just apportioning quotas. It's also something that can be used to mitigate climate change with geoengineering dimensions. We don't have a lot of knobs that we can turn on the climate system, but fisheries management apparently has something with the right scale of things that we can actually utilize to try to manage carbon in the deep ocean. So thank you for that. And I guess we'll have time for questions later.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And it's really informative, and it really highlights the outsized role that this group plays in the carbon cycle. So thank you very much. And I think that also provides a really nice context for the next talk, although my slides don't want to. There we go. And that's going to be from Dr. Jacob Bentley, that's focusing on the fishing impacts and how we can model those. Again, get your questions in. You can put them in the chat for Professor Visser, and we will come back to them the end of the talks. Jacob, please feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Debbie. Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob Bentley. I'm an ecosystem modeler based at Natural England. I'm here today to kind of, I guess, build what Andre was talking about, but discuss more about the modeling that we're going to be using in OceanICU to try and get a better understanding, I guess, of the whole biological carbon pump and carbon cycle, but also particularly through this work area, how fishing impacts that. There's a lot of models being used through OceanICU, which are eventually going to feed into decision support tools for policymakers and management decisions. But here we're focusing mainly on the fishing aspect. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Debbie. I thought I'd start off by just giving a brief overview of what ecosystem modeling is, because it's a term that's, I guess, it's used differently by a lot of different research communities, which can be quite confusing, particularly within projects like OceanICU, where it is very transdisciplinary. We have modelers and researchers coming from multiple backgrounds, but it's really a spectrum of different modeling tools that we're using to better understand the complexity of the marine environment. I've got an infographic on the screen here, which kind of goes through that spectrum. So ecosystem modeling kind of covers everything from physical models, which model changes in weather and water movements in the oceans. You then have these biogeochemical models, which focus more on kind of lower trophic organisms, so your zooplankton, phytoplankton, and nutrients. And then moving up in the spectrum, you have these models of intermediate complexity, which sometimes are used to look at just a component of a marine ecosystem. So a lot of the time, these types of models focus on commercial fish and their interactions with fisheries, and they don't necessarily look at other parts of the ecosystem in great detail. And then you step up in complexity and you get to these food web models, which try to capture the dynamics of the whole food web, everything from phytoplankton and zooplankton up through your benthic organisms, fish, seabirds, marine mammals. And then you throw on top the impacts of climate change, spatial prioritization, and even possibly link it through to socioeconomic impacts. But then kind of right to the top of complexity, you have these end-to-end models, which include all of that, but then also have kind of physical models included in them to drive all the dynamics in the models. So it can be quite complex. I mean, for the fisheries component, we're mainly sticking to these food web models and models of intermediate complexity, but through OceanICU, where all these other models are also being developed, we're going to be coupling up processes so that we're using the models that are best at doing certain jobs, so physical models and biogeochemical models, which are really good at that component of developing understanding of marine food webs. We use outputs from them to feed into our models, and vice versa. We'll use fisheries information to then feed back to these biogeochemical models. If you could go to the next slide, please. So how are these models being used operationally in management and policy today? There's quite a lot of ways that they are being operationally used, particularly in areas such as fisheries. They're being used to inform catch advice in the context of an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. So what are the impacts of fisheries actions on the marine ecosystem. They've been used to kind of guide us towards ecosystem-based fisheries management in a strategic sense, both looking at catch advice and different regulations for fishing fleets. They can then be used to feed into indicators of ecosystem health and function, which support a lot of our objectives for good environmental status of the oceans. They're then used quite a lot in kind of a research field to look at the impacts of long-term climate change, things like the International Panel on Climate Change scenarios of how ocean warming is going to impact the temperature of the oceans and the environment that the organisms living. And then we can use ecosystem models to simulate how we expect whole food webs and ecosystems to respond to that. Moving on, they're being used to look at marine spatial prioritization. So how do the impacts of things like marine protected areas or infrastructure developments impact ecosystem function? They can be very interactive, these models. So sometimes they're used for stakeholder engagement, which we're planning to do in OceanICU, and I'll come on to that in a bit. And finally, because the information that comes out of these models is so holistic, it looks at changes across the whole ecosystem, they're quite suitable for something like a natural capital approach, where we try to take our decisions and place them into a more holistic context and identify trade-offs between different objectives we have for the marine environment. So you go to the next slide, please. So in this work package, we're looking directly at fisheries, and we're going to be using models of ecosystems both on the shelf and off the shelf. And these models are being used to quantify the impacts of fisheries removals directly and indirectly through the way they changed how the food web functions, on how carbon is cycled in the marine environment and how it's sequestered. So the on-shelf models that we're going to be using include StrathE2E, EcoPath of Ecosim, and EcoTroph. And then the off-shelf models are Feisty and seabed. In the next few slides, I'll go through what these models are and how they're going to be used and how they have already been used in the last year. So next slide, please. So the on-shelf ecosystems, they're generally characterized by long-term and relatively high fisheries removals. In many cases, we see severely depleted fish stocks. And the importance of high fishing catches and the depleted stock levels of carbon budgets has not been well investigated, although there are several papers with quite conflicting ideas of the impacts of this. These do exist, but I guess the purpose of OceanICU is to really try and build on that understanding. So we're not kind of, I don't know, surrounded by multiple different, well, so that we get a better understanding of what the actual impact is. At the moment, it's quite uncertain within the research community whether it is important or whether the impact isn't important. And I think that's what OceanICU is trying to get to. We're going to be using 3 on-shelf models to try and better understand if and how fishing is important for the flow of the biological carbon pump on shelf ecosystems. So as I mentioned, the first is StrathE2E, which is a marine food web model of kind of intermediate complexity. It simulates the fluxes of nutrients, so primarily nitrogen, although it is being converted to carbon for this project. So it models the flow of nitrogen through the ecosystem, all the way from kind of dissolved inorganic nutrients through phytoplankton, benthos, fish, birds, and mammals, and then how those nutrients are regenerated through kind of excretion and mineralization of detritus in the water column. The second model we're using is EcoPath of Ecosim, and this is the most widely used food web modeling tool globally. Its food web structure tends to be a lot more complex than models like StrathE2E. It has the capacity for groups to be included to a species resolution, which can change depending on the model's purpose. It includes components to simulate network dynamics in kind of a steady state, as well as simulating how those dynamics have changed over time and space with the changing of marine pressures. And finally, we're going to be using EcoTroph, which is similar to StrathE2E in the fact that it's quite minimalist. But EcoTroph focuses on providing a simplified overview of ecosystem function by looking at the flows of biomass across trophic levels instead. So it's not looking specifically at species, but it's looking at how biomass changes in different trophic levels in the marine ecosystem. And the next slide should show you how these are being used. So a lot of the ongoing work within OceanICU with these models is to update their processes and how they're built in order to link the simulations to carbon impacts. For example, as I mentioned, where StrathE2E is traditionally used to simulate fluxes in nitrogen, it's being converted to carbon for this project. We also then have components of the EcoPath of Ecosim models and EcoTroph models that are being updated to better represent flows of detritus and how these interact with microbial communities and things like that. So one of the key deliverables of this project will be a suite of tools which are better designed and able to answer policy questions and management questions related to carbon sequestration. We attended a recent ICES workshop, WK Fish Carbon, so that's the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, which was chaired by Dave Reed, who's speaking after me. And we discussed the impacts of fishing on the biological carbon pump. So this workshop, as well as a blue carbon report that's recently come from the European Marine Board, concluded that the carbon sequestration from fish in shelf ecosystems, in terms of its quantity and importance, is probably one of the largest evident gaps of this research area. So to help address this, we're going to be directly feeding into WK Fish Carbon to provide some initial estimates of carbon sequestration from fish, particularly in the Irish Sea initially, to figure out how fishing may or may not be impacting carbon sequestration. Next slide, please. So now looking at the links between carbon sequestration and fishing off the shelf. So fishing in the off-shelf ecosystem falls into, I guess, two main categories. There's the epipelagic fish, which are mainly in the euphotic zone, so down to around 200 meters, and these include things like tuna and mackerel, where there already exist quite large fisheries for. Many of these species are already quite heavily exploited. And then you have the mesopelagic zone and the mesopelagic fish, which are found below 200 meters. There's not many fisheries for these, although there are a lot of policy discussions going on at the moment about whether or not this community should be fished. Although, linking back to the previous talk, it's questionable given their relatively large role in the movement and sequestration of carbon to the deep. So the first modeling approach which is being used is seabed. This is the spatial ecosystem and populations dynamic model, and this model predicts the temporal and spatial distribution of functional lower and mid-trophic level groups, including plankton groups and fish. And then it also looks at the epipelagic and the mesopelagic zone. The model was initially developed to look at tuna populations for fisheries applications, but its usage in some other projects has also been extended to look at things like turtles, cetaceans, and seals. The second off-shelf model that we're using is FEISTI, so Fisheries Size and Functional Type Model. This is a temporally dynamic and spatially explicit model of size-structured forage fish, pelagic fish, and demersal fish communities, which are defined by their size, habitat, and prey preference. The model then includes kind of this unstructured benthic invertebrate biomass pool and is coupled with biogeochemical models to simulate changes in zooplankton biomass and production. So next slide, please. Just like with the on-shelf models, a large component of the work of OceanICU is going to focus on further developing these tools to provide a framework to better address questions on the links between fishing and carbon sequestration. This includes developing better representation of zooplankton groups within the models and developing better estimates of carbon transfer to the deep ocean. These models, or some of these models, have already been used in the project to improve our understanding of the links between fisheries, pelagic fish, and carbon sequestration. So I put a paper at the bottom of this slide. In this paper, the study which was published earlier this year using seabed, it suggests that the exploitation of tuna populations by fisheries could or potentially has profoundly shaped the carbon dioxide balance of tuna populations, which has shifted over time from kind of a CO2 sink to a CO2 source. And this is mainly due to the fuel consumption that it takes to get boats out to fish them, but also the resulting impact on the biomass of tuna and how this has resulted in decline of deadfall and detritus to the seafloor. And then next slide, please. So this is my last slide. I just want to talk about how these models, which I've quickly run through, are going to be linking to the wider project. So the first part, which I've mentioned a little bit already, is the coupling approach. So we're going to be taking outputs and ways that these models are designed to look at fisheries and feeding them into the biogeochemical models that are being developed in other parts of OceanICU. And similarly, products from those models are going to feed into the models we're developing here. So the models we're building more accurately capture the dynamics happening at lower trophic levels. We're then going to be feeding simulations from our models into decision support tools, which will hopefully be co-created with stakeholders to answer some of their questions, including policymakers and decision makers. And then finally, we're really hoping to co-create some of these modeling approaches with stakeholders this approach, a few of us in this project underwent through an ICES working group called WK Irish a few years back, where we built food web models with stakeholders and kind of co-developed the information that went into the models, including the use of traditional scientific data, as well as knowledge from stakeholders on things like fish diets and effort changes in fishery fleets over time. And we found that by kind of developing models through this approach, it gave everyone a bit more ownership and believability in the models, and kind of really pushed them through to have operational impact. And it's led to these longer lasting relationships in order to use these models, I guess, to address more wider stakeholder questions. And I believe Debbie may want to mention something, but I think there's some stakeholder workshops that are already set up for the end of February next year. And with that, I think that's it. So my next slide, yeah, I just put on here a big thank you to everyone that contributed information to this presentation. So there's a lot of modelers involved in this part of the work that are there on the screen. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bentley. That's very informative, and we really appreciate it. It's nice we've got the what, what are we looking at coming from Professor Visser, and now the how are we planning on doing that. And I think we're moving on to some of the why and the questions, the controversy there will be enlightened by Professor Reid. And I will indeed be coming back with some more information on the stakeholder engagement after Professor Reid has spoken to us. So stay tuned. Over to you.
Okay, you can hear me okay, I hope?
We can, yes, loud and clear.
Yep, so I'm gonna take what Andy produced and what Jacob showed you and take it down to a quite low level where we can actually start asking direct questions. It's all about the role of fishing in the ocean carbon cycle, but in the shelf seas, where, as Jacob said, we know a lot less. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Now, the reason this is important, I mean, if you look at this map of the world, the open ocean is probably at least half or more of it. But what this map shows is where you find areas of high fishing overlapping with areas of high carbon export to the seafloor. So I've circled area 27 here. These are FAO regions. And you can see that there's almost the whole area of the European Western Shelf and down into the North Sea are areas of high carbon export and high fishing. So you're getting a lot of fishing going on in the places where you're actually doing a lot of carbon export. That's really critical. And you'll see, in fact, this is true all around the world, that the most of it goes on in coastal shelf regions. Next slide, please. So what we've built, or what we're setting out to do, is taking all that clever stuff that Andy and Jacob talked about and making a really quite simple model of what would happen in a particular place in the world and examine the scale of the carbon transport to the seabed and the potential interruption of that by fishing. So our model area is the Irish Sea, which is a nice constrained area to the east of Ireland, between Ireland and Britain. And it's basically just set up quite simply. We model the herring biomass and the herring biomass with fishing or without fishing. We then look at how much fecal pellets they produce, as one of my colleagues insists on calling poo. So that drops through the water column, and as it does so, things will start to metabolize what's going on there. So you saw that in Andy's Van de Graaff's ladder. But the different thing about somewhere like the Irish Sea is we're not talking about 3,500 meters of drop through the water column. These fish live about 20 to 30 meters, and they hit the seabed at 70 meters. So it's a very fast transport. And when it gets there, there's lots of things that are ready to eat it and enjoy it. And so you get this flux in the seabed where most of the carbon, most of the biological carbon mass is actually being eaten and then excreted by other species. So only a proportion of it is buried. And the same applies to deadfall. This is herring. So some of these herring will eventually die and drop to the seabed. Again, there might be a water column component to that, but probably not much. And then when they get to the bottom, they're eaten by things like crabs. And probably the main part that gets buried is the skeleton. So we're going to try and model this, or I'm not even sure I could give it the name of a model. It's just an analysis. Next slide, please. So that picture that we saw before is that process, which is often called the biological carbon pump. But there's another aspect to it, and Jacob picked this up really nicely, is the food web, the links between, if you take one fish or another fish, you'll get different reactions in the food web. This is a really simplistic cartoon version of that. So on the left, you've got a box which is where you're not fishing heavily on a species like cod. As a result, the cod predate on the herring, which is the next species down. And so you get a smaller population of herring. Herring predate on zooplankton. So if you've got fewer herring, then you get more zooplankton. And as a result, you get more carbon coming in. And the picture on the left is just the opposite. If we fish lots of cod, we get more herring, we get less zooplankton, and the carbon flux to the seabed is reduced. So that's the other aspect of the system. What happens, what are the food web changes that happen as a result of fishing? Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So here's a really, really simple model, and most modelers would look at this aghast, but it's just a simple exploration of the scope of the business. And so we have the fish carcasses and fish fecal pellets, which I talked about before. And then we're also going to include the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, which are also major contributors to the carbon that goes into the seabed. When that carbon goes into the seabed, some of it will be remineralized, it will be turned back into carbon dioxide and come back into the water column and hence back into the atmosphere. So we're trying to model each of these components in a very simple way. We use the food web model to do the top part, the blue, green, and yellow circles, and then we use a very simple remineralization model in the seabed to bring it back up. Next slide, please. So I'm going to jump on now to a very vexed subject. When I'm talking to fishermen, this one comes up every time. So this is a clip from the Guardian newspaper in the UK with the rather contentious title that bottom trawling releases as much carbon as air travel. And this caused a lot of excitement in the world of the scientists who work on benthic impacts. And we put a label on this because it is contested. Next slide, please. So the paper was by a guy called Enric Sala and his collaborators. And what it suggested was there's something like 1.47 petagrams, gigatons of aqueous CO2 per year released by the impact of trawling, fishing on the seabed, which is equivalent to about 15 to 20% of the CO2 that actually goes into the ocean. So basically, the argument would be on this paper is that by fishing, we're releasing a lot of CO2 back into the water and therefore back into the atmosphere. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, it's contested, and I've lifted a couple of quotes out of another paper by Jan Hiddink and colleagues. And the first quote is that bottom trawling disrupts natural carbon flows in seabed ecosystems due to seabed sediment mixing, resuspension, and changes. Now, the reason I put that in is none of us contest that seabed bottom trawling will disrupt the seabed. It will lift up sediment. It will cause more particles to come back into the water column. The question is not so much that happens, it's that how much of that then gets back into the system. And I'm not going to comment on this. I can't scientifically comment, but second quote is that Sala et al.'s approach may result in an overestimation of CO2 released. And that's to do with the types of CO2, the types of seabed, and indeed the types of fishing. And so they reckon that Sala et al. Overestimated that 20% of the CO2 going back into the water column, possibly by up to 3 orders of magnitude. Next slide, please. And just to add to I don't know if it's the controversy or the uncertainty, as Jacob said, we're very uncertain about what's going on in this shelf sea system. But this is a review done by Graham Epstein and colleagues, looked at 49 different studies that looked at this issue of how much organic carbon there is in the seabed before and after trawling caused disturbance. And what they found was that for 2/3 of them, they reported no significant effect. But There were about a third of them that reported that fishing had lowered the organic carbon stocks, but quite interestingly and perhaps remarkably, 10% of them reported that after fishing, the seabed was sequestrating a higher level of carbon than it had prior to fishing. I'm not saying which one of these or which of these categories is correct. I suspect it is very much variant on the type of fishing, the type of seabed, the type of ocean, the water temperature. You can go on and on. But what it's saying is that no single quick analysis that produces a percentage going back into the water column should be taken fully at face value. Next slide, please. And at that, I'll thank my collaborators. Jacob, you've met. Emma, Simeon, and Paula are all doing work on this project with me. And we hope to start producing results on that little Irish Sea simple model in about 3 months or so. So thank you very much and stay in touch.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Professor Reid. Always nice to learn about controversies in science. I'm sure that there will be some questions around that. Again, the Q&A is open, so please do pop your questions in there. And then it's over to me just for 2 slides to tell you about our stakeholder engagement, and then we will be answering your questions. So hopefully this will, there we go. So part of the work that we're doing within OceanICU is trying to connect the work that we're doing to society, to the benefits and impacts that society receive from marine fisheries, but also from the ocean in general through the carbon cycling processes, but also to try and identify how we can make this relevant for stakeholders in society. So how can we develop outputs that are usable, can be taken up, can be applied in policy, for instance, and management procedures. So I am co-leading this with my colleagues, Professor Mary Weiss and Natalie Van Isaker. And we are interested in trying to recruit stakeholders who are interested in climate, fisheries, marine mining, areas beyond national jurisdiction, marine policy, any of these kinds of things. Stakeholder knowledge, we're hoping to incorporate, as Jacob mentioned, industry trends. And we want to also develop ocean futures and get an understanding of which way we expect these will go in the future, and identify management and policy needs. So if this is something that you think you would be interested in, then I would encourage you to scan the QR code here and to sign up for our stakeholder panels. We would love to have you join us. And I will also post the, oh wait, no, I can't post in the chat, but it will be sent out to you guys with the swag bag following on from the webinar. So that's pretty much all I had to say. So I will check now for the Q&A. Just give me one moment. Apologies. Technical issues over my end. Okay, so we had a question here that was asking, what happens if we stop fishing for 10 years? Will that help climate change? Will I go to Professor Visser first to see what you have to say on that?
Yeah, this. I mean, it's an interesting question because it sort of like encompasses a lot of things. But basically, I would answer basically that we are restoring a system back to what it was, and in some sense, we're not going to be sequestering more carbon, but we're going to stop the emission of carbon that's already in the ocean. This might be a little bit tricky for some people to understand, but you know, that huge pool of carbon that's kept down there by all kinds of life is actually there because of past generations that have put it down there. And if you know, due to the fishing, we've made a big dent in some of those populations of fish, and that's then taken out the process that's kept that in the ocean, and now it's being emitted actually into the atmosphere again. And by stopping fishing, we would allow those stocks to rebound, and we would be, if you will, allowing that process to come back to equilibrium. That's the short answer from my side.
Thank you. Professor Reid, would you like to weigh in there?
Yeah, I have a subtly different perspective. I think everything Andy said is absolutely correct. But in terms of the carbon, it sort of assumes that the stable state equilibrium environment that you end up with is going in terms, just in simply terms of carbon sequestration, is it going to be as effective as the current situation? So it's still for me an open question. Here we go. This is controversy among scientists. A good example would be Amazon rainforest, where the climax community holds a lot of carbon but doesn't take in much more. So you have this sort of contrast between systems. So yeah, I think as I've sworn I'd never say, the answer is complex. And of course we've got to balance that against the services, the goods and services we get out of that system, because if you're not getting the fish from the sea, you're getting it from somewhere else. And if you're getting it from somewhere else, does that have a carbon impact? So nothing is simple.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Dr. Bentley, do you have any perspectives on that? For instance, in the modelling that you're doing, are you planning to try out that scenario?
No, I think it really, everything I can say just builds on what Dave and Andre have already said. It's uncertain, and we don't really know at the moment if stopping fishing would increase carbon sequestration via the biological carbon pump, because we don't really know what its impact is. And like Dave said, we don't know what that equilibrium is. It may help in terms of nature recovery, but we don't know whether that equals increased carbon sequestration. And that's something that we'll be trying to investigate through this project by looking at different simulations of fishing, no fishing, reduced fishing, fishing at maximum sustainable yield, and kind of other ecosystem levels. So it's something that we're looking into, but then I think the way that this project is working as well, and the fact that we're collaborating with the stakeholders, we're going to want to also look at the kind of the trade-offs of activities like that and how it would have socioeconomic impacts to different communities.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Always nice to hear the ecosystem services and socioeconomic impacts being taken into account as well. And we have a question here saying, assuming, how will the reduction in fish biomass from fishing have affected the partitioning of carbon between the surface and the deep the deep ocean and overall storage? I guess we should probably go to Andre on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, so this I guess this is from Richard. Okay. But basically, I mean, there will be a change in the partitioning, but I think more important, and it's sort of like it's relevant to this point, but it's not quite the answer that Richard wants, basically. But there are different types of fish have different impacts on the carbon sequestration, and I could rank them fairly generally. The most important ones are sort of like the mesopelagics that migrate a lot. The next important are the pelagic fish, the guys that sit in the surface. And the least important in terms of carbon sequestration are demersal fish. So depending on where you take those fish, they can have a huge impact on the total amount of carbon that's sequestered. And there's arguments for why that might be so, and I'd be happy to go into that. But that was sort of like my take on that. And I think it's a better, I think it's perhaps more useful to think of it in terms of that than rather talking about where the carbon is being sequestered.
Well, you've opened the door for me there to follow up on that mesopelagic comment. So have you any perspectives on what happens to our carbon pump if we do start fishing on mesopelagics, for instance?
Yeah, so mesopelagics they play a very important role, and I've kind of gone through some of the numbers, but I don't know exactly. There is no market number for landings of mesopelagics yet, but in some sense we can actually go through and start to do economic models to figure out exactly what is the relative cost in terms of the landings of mesopelagic protein or biomass versus the service that they provide. And I've given a number for the service that they provide. They are involved in the sequestration of so many gigatons of carbon per year, and we can actually use that to drive a fairly rigorous economic model to figure out exactly what that is. And I haven't crunched the numbers yet. It's more that I can sort of see that it is perhaps the most important biomass. I mean, if you're going to rank biomass in terms of its value for for carbon sequestration, then mesopelagics are pretty high on the list. Pelagic fish, not so much, and benthic or demersal fish, not at all. So that's really, you know, all I can say right now. That if we're going to approach this, and it's not just the mesopelagic. There are other fisheries also being developed on krill. That's also being targeted more and more as a source of protein, especially in the Southern Ocean, and that also has a huge role in carbon sequestration. And then there's the developing tendency for fishing down the food web. In other words, fishing out the copepods all the way down at that level. And they, again, are important players in this carbon sequestration role. So I think in some sense, we're developing the tools where we can start to look at exactly what the balance of services are in terms of harvesting potential versus carbon sequestration. But I'm not ready to make a definitive answer on that quite yet.
So more work to do. Lucky for us, we have some time to explore this within OceanICU. I think I'll direct this one to Dave or Jacob, because it's relating to food web. So picking up a bit on what Andre was just saying. There's a question about, have we restructured marine food webs permanently via fishing? And do we think that if we were to stop fishing, would that lead us back to a different place than where we started? Or would it just be, you know, recovery to whatever pristine is? Who would like to give it a go first?
I can say something first if you want, Dave, and then you can correct me.
Go for it.
In terms of have we restructured marine food webs, I think it's likely that fishing has definitely had an impact on the trophic structure of marine food webs. But then I think the second part of that question of what would happen if we stopped, where would it go back to, kind of leans on a lot of discussions we're having now in terms of policy direction for nature recovery, and what does nature recovery mean? What does that look like if we stop fishing now? Would it go back to how things were, you know, a few decades ago? And it's a really difficult question when we're setting objectives that we want things to recover to levels that they were in pre-industrial level, because now we're in a completely different regime, not just in the way we use the marine environment, because there are obviously other sectors that are impacting the biota and habitats, but also it's a completely different set of environmental variables out there now. You know, it's a lot warmer than it was a few decades ago. So recovery for some species aren't necessarily as possible as we'd wish they were. So I think we're more looking at trying to make sure the way we interact with the environment doesn't hinder recovery where it's possible, and kind of enables a sense of resilience to things like climate change. I don't know if that covers that, or Dave, is there anything you want to pick up on?
No, I think you picked up on everything I would say. I mean, the big problem is when we talk about can we take it back to where we were before, is that where we were before was under a different set of world conditions. And so we can never actually know if we've got back to where we were before, because even if we hadn't disturbed it, it would be a different system now to what it was 100 years ago. So yeah, that confirms what you've just said. I think we have certainly restructured marine food webs by fishing. I think that's beyond doubt. But whether or not it's reversible is very debatable. But we can certainly get back to a better place where any removals are sustainable, doesn't do any further damage to the ecosystem. And of course, it then becomes a question of what do you want from your ecosystem? Is it resource? Is it food resources? Is it carbon sequestration resources? Is it an aesthetic cultural resource that you want there? And so the answer again is complicated, because there's a number of ways that we value the ocean. And what you really want to do is get the best amount of food for the least amount of damage to the carbon sequestration, and keep it looking nice so we can go to the seashore.
Good, thank you very much. I guess even if we could, we don't necessarily know what the pristine or recovered would be, because we don't have the data going back in most places, in most areas, and particularly in relation to something like ocean carbon, right? So I guess my next question for you guys would be, well, directly to Jacob. You mentioned in your talk that you can use these models to inform management and policy. I know it's early days here in the OceanICU project, but do you have thoughts on how the kind of modeling work that you're doing within OceanICU would be able to feed through to management or policy, and in what way could it contribute?
Yes, certainly. There's already some interest in products from these models feeding into new management plans and policy decisions, especially as management's starting to shift more or recognize now that it really needs to start moving towards an ecosystem-based approach. And to do that requires complex questions that sometimes have complex answers. And the space in order to answer those questions needs to involve risk assessment and analysis of trade-offs. So some of the questions that we've been having from policy recently in regard to fisheries is beyond the impact on individual species and looking to the ecosystem to kind of take note of natural capital and how fishing impacts the wider ecosystem. And carbon impacts comes under that. So in terms of the stuff that we want to do with modeling, we are going to run scenarios of different fishing simulations and strategies and see how this impacts wider ecosystem and then how that transfers to carbon impacts. And that kind of, it might not be a tactical restraint that we set on management or like the way that catch limits are set, but it's more strategic information that can inform how decisions are made. It assesses if you go down one path, there may be a greater risk of reducing carbon sequestration. And that's the kind of information that we're planning on feeding back, because it's like Dave said, and like everyone's been saying, there is so much uncertainty attributed to this as well. So we really need to be quite confident in the way that we're conveying and communicating that uncertainty, so the information was used is useful in the strategic kind of trade-off assessment space.
And that's really the crux of the issue, isn't it? Really just being able to better inform on the trade-offs that exist by accounting for these areas of uncertainty that we have. And with that, actually, maybe I'll go to you, Dave. Why are we so uncertain? Why is this such a black box area? You know, why is there such a strong need for a project like OceanICU? Why don't we know what we don't know? Can you answer that?
Why don't we know what we don't know? Yeah, well, I guess we've only, I mean, Andy touched on this in his talk, is that we've only recently started to work out what the implications of the fish biomass actually is. You know, when I came into this project, and that was only like maybe 2 years ago, I was firmly of the view that some of the publications that suggested fishing was disastrous for carbon were really couldn't be right, because as Andy showed in his picture, the actual biomass of carbon in fish is negligible. And then I saw a presentation by Andy, and he taught me the error of my ways. And it's that multiplier that the biology is not just the body of the fish, it's the body of its feces, its poo. And if you start to think about how much biomass there is in your own body and how much poo you've produced in a lifetime, it starts to show you how that all works. So, yeah, I think that the answer is that everything we've found out sort of back down the road, as always in science, raises more questions than it answers. But it does answer questions, but it then says you've got to think about something else. So that would be my answer.
So the fish and ourselves, we're not just bodies, we're also machines that are processing other things and having a wider effect on the environment.
Just so.
Cool. Okay, I think we're just about to finish up, but I guess I'm going to ask one last question. And it's relating to, you know, the type of project that we're working in. How important do you guys think it is to have these multidisciplinary approaches to a topic like ocean carbon? Any takers?
Oh, I'll take that one. I think the importance is that if you work in a vacuum, you know, if you're in your own little capsule of science, you don't then understand why it's difficult for you to understand wider implications. So in the last year, I've been learning biogeochemistry, a word I couldn't even pronounce 18 months ago. And I understand much more about the links between biogeochemistry and what we're doing by fishing. And at the same time, I start to understand that debate about how the impact occurs on the seabed, which brings in benthic ecologists. And I've started talking to a sort of hybrid species of biogeochemical benthic ecologists, if that's the right word. And so you start to think holistically. You know, if I do this, that will change this, which will change that. So you can't simply say, let's to put it into economic terms, and if you were Margaret Thatcher, let's control the money supply and that will solve all the problems. Well, it won't. It will create new problems. So you need to understand it holistically, or try to understand it holistically, so you can then anticipate the unanticipated.
Yeah.
And also to add in a plug, of course, for the social scientists and the policy side of things as well, to be able to make that real world impact. I guess it's important to have them on board too. Sorry, Andre, I think you were going to add something there.
Yeah, no, I just want to support that, and basically, I just want to state, that the most fertile parts of any sort of endeavor, human endeavor, science included, always happens in the interface between two different disciplines, two different things coming together, where there's a degree of cross-fertilization. And that's exactly what these projects do in their multidisciplinary approach. That is this continuous cross-fertilization of methods, of ideas, of interactions, just going on all the time. And that really is quite an important sort of aspect of any of these large endeavors.
Brilliant. Jacob, any final words for us?
No, I don't think so. I think it summed up nicely.
Wonderful. Well, I think that just leads me to thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you found it interesting and informative. Thank you very much to our speakers for your time and energy and the interesting talks you have given to us. And we hope that you have enjoyed it, and watch out for our next one. You can also stay up to date with any of the OceanICU work through our website. We also have a newsletter, and please do consider joining our stakeholder panels, because we would love to have you more deeply involved in the work that we are doing. Thank you very much.